Veronika decides to die. On November 11th, 1997, Veronika decided that the moment to kill herself had at last arrived. She carefully cleaned the room that she rented in a convenient, turned off the heat, brushed her teeth, and lay down. She picked up the 4 packs of sleeping pills from her bedside table. Instead of crushing them and mixing them with water, she decided to take them one by one, because there is always a gap between intention and action, and she wanted to feel free to turn back halfway. With each pill she swallowed, however, she felt more convinced. After 5 minutes, the packs were empty. Since she didn't know exactly how long it would take her to lose consciousness, she had placed on the bed the month's issue of French magazine Home, which had just arrived in the library where she worked. She had no particular interest in computer science, but as she lived through the magazine, she came across an article about a computer game, one of those CD-ROMs created by Paulo Coelho, a Brazilian writer she had happened to meet at a lecture in the coffee at the Grand Union Hotel. They had exchanged a few words, and she had ended up being invited by his publisher to join them for supper. There were a lot of people, though, and they hadn't had a chance to talk in depth about anything. The fact that she had met the author led her to think that he was part of her world, and that reading an article about his work could help pass the time. While she was waiting for date, Veronika started reading about computer science, a subject in which she was not the least bit interested. But then that was in keeping with what she had done all her life, always looking for the easy option, for whatever was nearest at hand, like that magazine, for example. To her surprise, though, the first line of text shocked her out of her natural positivity. The tranquilizers had not yet dissolved in her stomach, but Veronika was by nature passive, and for the first time in her life, it made her ponder the truth of saying that was very fashionable among all her friends. Nothing in this world happens by chance. Why that first line? At precisely the moment when she had begun to die, what was the hidden message she saw before her? Assuming there are such things as hidden message rather than mere coincidence. Underneath an illustration of the computer game, the journalist began his article by asking, "Where is Salvania?" Honestly, she thought no one ever knows where Salvania is. But Salvania existed nonetheless, and it was outside. Inside, in the mountains round her, and in the square she was looking out at, Salvania was her country. She put the magazine to one side, There was no point now in getting indignant with a world that knew absolutely nothing about the Salvanis. Her nation's honor no longer concerned her. It was time to feel proud of herself, to recognize that she had been able to do this, that she had finally had the courage and was living this life. What joy! Also, she was doing it as she had always dreamed she would, by taking sleeping pills which leave no mark. Veronika had been trying to get hold of the pills for nearly 6 months, thinking that she would never manage it. She had even considered slashing her wrists. It didn't matter that the room would end up awash in blood, and the nuns would be left feeling confused and troubled, for suicide demons that people think of themselves first and others later. She was prepared to do all she could so that her diet would cause a little upset as possible. But if slashing her wrists was the only way, then she had no option, and the nuns could clean up the room and quickly forget the whole story. Otherwise, they would find it hard to rent out the room again. We may live at the end of the 20th century, but people still believe in ghosts. Obviously, she could have thrown herself off one of the few tall buildings in Lajubeljana. But what about the further suffering a fall from such a height would cause her parents, apart from the shock of learning that their daughter had died? They would also have to identify the disfigured corpse. No, that was a worse solution than bleeding to death, because it would leave indelible marks on two people who only wanted the best for her. They would get used to their daughter's diet eventually, but it must be impossible to forget a shattered skull, shooting, jumping off a high building, hanging. None of these options suited her feminine nature. When when they kill themselves, choose for more romantic methods like slashing their wrists or taking an overdose of sleeping pills. Abandoned princes and Hollywood actresses have provided numerous examples of this. Veronika knew that life was always a matter of waiting for the right moment to act, and so it proved to be the case. In response to her complaints that she could no longer sleep at the right, two friends offered monies to get hold of 2 packs each of powerful drug used by musicians at a local nightclub. Veronica left the 4 packs on her bedside table for a week, courting approaching date and saying goodbye entirely unsentimentally to what people call life. Now she was there, glad she had gone all the way, and bored because of she didn't know what to do with the little time that was left to her. She thought again about the absurd question she had just read. How could an article about computers begin with such an idiotic opening line? Where is Salvania? Having nothing more interesting to do, she decided to read the whole article, and she learned that the said computer game had been made in Salvania, that strange country that no one seemed quite able to place, except the people who lived there, because it was a cheap source of labor. A few months before, when the product was launched, the French manufacturer had given a party for journalists from all over the world in a castle in Veld. Veronika remembered reading something about the party, which had been quite an event in the city, not just because the castle had been re-recording in order to match as closely as possible the medieval atmosphere of the CD-ROM, but because of the controversy in the local press. Journalists from Germany, French, Britain, Italy, and Spain had been invited, but not a single Salvanian. Holmes, correspondent who was visiting Salvania for the first time, doubtless with all expenses paid, and determined to spend his visit talking to other journalists, making supposedly interesting comments and enjoying the free food and drink at the castle, had decided to begin his article with a joke that must have appealed to the sophisticated intellectual of his country. He had probably told his fellow journalists on the magazine various untrue stories about local costumes too, and said how badly Salvani women dress. That was his problem. Veronika was dying, and she had other concerns, such as wondering if there was life after death or when her body would be found. Nevertheless, or perhaps precisely because of the important decision she had taken, the article bothered her. She looked out of the convenient window that gave on to the small square in Lajbulania. If they don't know where Salvania is, then Lajbulania must be a myth, she thought, like Atlantis or Lumira, the other lost continents that fell means imaginations. No one anywhere in the world would begin an article asking where Mount Everest was, even if they had never been there. Yet, in the middle of Europe, a journalist on an important magazine felt no shame at asking such a question because he knew that most of his readers would not know where Salvania was, still is its capital, Lajbuljina. It was then that Veronika found a way of passing the time. Now that 10 minutes had gone by and she had still not noticed any physical change, the final act of her life would be to write a letter to the magazine explaining that Salvania was one of the five republics into which the former Yugoslavia had been divided. The letter would be her suicide note. She would give no explanation of the real reasons for her death. When they find her body, they will conclude that she had killed herself because a magazine did not know where her country was. She loved to think of the controversy in the newspaper with some four and some against her suicide, committed in honor of her country cause. And she was shocked by how quickly she could change her mind, since only moments before she had thought exactly the opposite, that the world and other geographical problems were no longer her concerns. She wrote the letter. That moment of good humor almost made her have second thoughts about the need to die. But she had already taken the pills. It was too late to turn back. Anyway, she had had such moments before. And besides, she was not killing herself because she was a sad, embittered woman, constantly depressed. She had spent many afternoons walking joyfully along the streets of Lajbuljana or gazing from the window in her convenient room at the snow falling on the small square with its states of the Butte. Once for almost a month she had felt as if she were walking on her air, all because a complete stranger in the middle of that very square had given her a flower. She believed herself to be completely normal. Two very simple reasons lay behind her decision to die, and she was sure that were she leave a note explaining, many people would agree with her. The first reason, everything in her life was the same, and once her youth was gone, it would be downhill all the way, with old age beginning to leave irrever- irreversible marks. The onset of illness, the departure of friends, she would gain nothing by continuing to live. Indeed, the likelihood of suffering would only increase. The second reason was more philosophical. Veronika read the newspaper, watched TV, and she was aware of what was going on in the world. Everything was wrong, and she had no way of putting things right. That gave her a sense of complete powerlessness. In a short while, though, she would have the final experience of her life, which promised to be very different. Yet, she wrote the letter to the magazine, then abandoned the topic and concentrated on more pressing matters, more appropriate to what she was living, rather dying, though at that moment. She tried to imagine what it would be like to die, but failed to reach any conclusion. Besides, there was no point worrying about that, for in a few moments she would find out how many minutes. She had no idea, but she realized the thought that she was about to find out the answer to the question that everyone asked themselves. Does God exist? Unlike many people, this had not been the great inner debate of her life. Under the old communist regime, the official line in schools had been that life ended with death, and she had gotten used to the idea. On the other hand, her parents' generation and her grandparents' generation still went to church, said prayers, and went on pilgrimage, and were utterly convinced that God listened to what they said. At 24, having experienced everything she would experience, and That was no small achievement. Veronika was almost certain that everything ended with diet. That is why she had chosen suicide. Freedom at last, eternal oblivion. And her heart of hearts, though there was still a doubt, what if God did exist? Thousands of years of civilization had made of suicide a taboo, an affront to all religious code. Man struggled to survive, not to succumb. The human race must procreate. Society needs workers. A couple has to have a reason to stay together, even when love has ceased to exist. And a country needs soldiers, politicians, and artists.